I'm so pleased to be here today representing SNC-Lavalin. As a proud long-term partner of the C2P3 Annual Conference, I'd like to thank the organization for bringing us all together, and especially to all of you for being with us today after almost 3 years of virtual conferences and meetings. The C2P3 organization has been a leading force on the major project landscape for decades and continue to provide industry leaders and change makers with an important platform to discuss new ideas. The conference also been a catalyst for improvement on our private sector works together on public and private sector works together on major projects. In previous years, we used this platform to discuss new approach on how traditional P3 project in Canada can be delivered with renewed focus on partnerships that require culture of collaboration, transparency, and effective management of risk. As we look to the future, I would like to reaffirm SNC-Lavalin's commitments to developing well-engineered community with efficient and sustainable infrastructure as their foundation. At SNC-Lavalin, we believe that the first step of engineering a better future for our planet and its people is to develop solutions for positive changes. Beyond employing the latest innovation and best practice to drive business growth and produce stakeholder value, we must offer an integrated approach that combines innovation, business change, and promotes sustainable behaviors within our community. We must recognize what we can do to strengthen our social economic development and what we can do better by bringing together to the table with us, including Canadian Indigenous community. For over 40 years, SNC-Lavalin has partnered and fostered mutually beneficial relationships with Indigenous community, leveraging their knowledge of the vast Canadian landscape, their unique skills, cultural intelligence, and environmental stewardship to deliver some of our most iconic projects. Projects like the LRT Evergreen Line extension, which connect the city of Burnaby through the city of Port Moody and the city of Coquitlam. Before beginning work on that project, SNC-Lavalin developed a First Nation plan that looked at employment and procurement opportunity with Indigenous community in this area. We also work with North Vancouver Island Aboriginal Training Society to help assist First Nation people to gain employment on the Charnhart project. The Charnhart Generation Station in British Columbia provides non-emitting clean hydroelectric power throughout the province. Another example is Ontario Ring of Fire region in the northwest of the province, where we have been working for many years with our client, Wikibe First Nations, on community engagement, environmental assessment, and early engineering work to support the development of supply road in the Ring of Fire mining basin. Through this project, as well as being a member of the Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business and certified by the Progressive Aboriginal Relation Program, the PAR program, SNC-Lavalin has worked hard to strengthen the foundation for economic reconciliation and Aboriginal autonomy. And if the last 40 years are any indication, our work with Indigenous community will continue. In fact, I am very pleased to announce that just this morning, we officially launched Indigenous E3, a SPP formed between SNC-Lavalin and Indigenous Community Engagement, ICE. Together, we will identify and deliver projects that are meaningful to Indigenous people within Canada. This project will support the advancement and long-term prosperity while enabling Indigenous community to be able to access SNC-Lavalin unique end-to-end expertise across the entire company. And now, without further delay, I am pleased to introduce today keynote speaker, Mr. Michael Fox. Mr. Fox is the president of Indigenous Community and Engagement, ICE, one of Canada's leading Indigenous firms specializing in community-based research, assessment and capacity building, and community engagement and development. As the president of ICE, Mr. Fox played an important role in facilitating Indigenous corporate development, governance training, management, reviews, and need assessment across Canada. Before joining ICE, Mr. Fox was president of Fox High Impact Consulting, a national firm that specialized in Aboriginal processes, participation, and partnership development in the energy and mineral sectors. He has also assisted Northern Ontario First Nation with economic development initiative with the main natural resource development sectors of Ontario, and act as a key partner between First Nation prospect proponents and government agencies. Michael Fox holds an MBA from University of Fredericton and has an extensive experience working with Indigenous organizations through his professional and volunteer work. Please join me, ladies and gentlemen, in welcoming Mr. Michael Fox.
Miigwech. It's kind of interesting listening to your own bio. You know, have you ever paused to think about your own biography? You know, the story that you share with the world. It's a personal story, right, based on abilities and achievement. When I hear mine, it feels like I'm perpetuating, you know, the myth of the self-made man. You know, it sort of takes discipline. You know, it takes focus, and yes, it takes tenacity. It even takes grit. And I love that word grit because it's a personal attribute, right? Like, you know, that gives one sole credit of all one's achievement. But if you take a closer look, if you're a bit more honest, you'll see that it's one's immediate environment, one's enabling environment, you know, that enables one to be grounded, that enables one to be focused, you know, that enables one to be successful. You know, so supporting environments matter for people that are trying to achieve prosperity, you know, for their own nations. You know, when I was 20 years old, I just came out of childhood and teenagehood, you know, sort of focused, full of chaos and confusion, craziness. I was a survivor of intergenerational trauma, an innocent victim of the 60s scoop, when I was taken away from my mother by Children's Aid Society when I was 2 years old and put into a non-Indigenous home. That was the beginning point, you know, sort of becoming a lost soul, you know, of with no family, no base, no identity. So when I turned 20, you know, I was sobering up, and I was fortunate enough to have counseling. You know, to have therapy to deal with, you know, my deep wounds, my deep anxieties, and trying to catch a deep breath from my demons. You know, in one of those sessions, you know, the therapist asked me, if I had to write my own eulogy, what would I write? What would you write? You know, as I paused to look at the therapist, you know, I actually started to cry. I sobbed because, you know, up to that point, up to that moment of my life, it was mostly about victimization and deprivation and condemnation. And that was the reality of my life in the mainstream of 1970s and 1980s. That was my lived experience after leaving my reserve on the Hudson Bay coastline. And where is that, I hear you ask? That's a picture of my grandfather on the mighty river of Winnisk on the left there. My community is part of the Mushkegowuk Nation, Maik and Sheik Abwaitim Natishnacash. So I'm the son of the Mushkegowuk people from the Hudson Bay coastline. My grandfather there, he had 10 kids. 8 died. Only my mother and my uncle survived. My mom was taken away from her parents for 10 years, and raised in an institutional setting called St. Anne Residential School, one of the most notorious residential school in the country. Look it up. And I was taken away from my mom at 2 years during the 60 scoop. And you wonder, what is the 60 scoop? The 60 scoop is when they started closing the residential schools, but implemented a public policy to start taking away kids from their family and putting them to non-Indigenous homes far away from their family of origin without their consent. So many kids, many Indigenous kids like me, were placed in homes away from their family. So this picture is my mother. It's the only picture I have as an infant with my mom. And I share this because there's still a thick wall of ignorance out there of what happened to many of us, including my generation with shining biographies. So we do what we do to chip away from that wall of ignorance by telling our own truth. And that is part of the truth. So it had to be said. So let's move on to reconciliation. First things first, and the first thing here is the First Peoples. Here's my community. I told you I was from the Hudson Bay coastline, Winnisk First Nations. As you can see, Winnisk is part of the largest provincial park in Ontario called the Polar Bear Provincial Park. And my family still live there, enjoy the pristine lands of that environment. Even I do. That's me in the corner there with my daughter going caribou hunting, on the Hudson Bay coastlines with my cousins. Not that far away is another community called KI, or formerly Big Trout First Nations. They created a documentary called Third World Canada that highlighted, the community and many communities like them that are underfunded, underserved, underprivileged. When you Google Third World, you get pictures like this. What do you see here? Actually, I should ask you, what don't you see? You don't see public service. You don't see public institutions. You don't see public infrastructure. Basic needs, have to be met before one can think about the future. If you're in pain, you can't think about the future. It's like a kid who scrapes his knee, like they're in the moment. Or if you bang your fingernail with a hammer, like you're in the moment. You're not thinking about the weekend or the winter vacation. Like that's very, very similar. There's no difference with communities that are in crisis, that are in state of emergencies. It's hard to think about the future when you're trying to deal with immediate needs. When you're trying to, you're not doing economic thinking. You're not doing economic planning. It's because it's so future orientated. Like education, it's no immediate benefits. It takes time, effort, to move on economic initiatives. It's like, so you got to deal with the social as you deal with the economic. I remember Chief Connie McKay from Mushkegowuk First Nations told me when I was a very young man, and her wisdom was being shared. She goes, Mike, I know you're business smart, but there's communities that need a social strategy along with economic strategy. You can create all the business and economic opportunities for these communities, but if they got an unhealthy workforce, all your plans are going to unravel. She was bang on that. And that was about 20 years ago she was telling me that. And so I started thinking about what is missing? Why is it we can't do strategic planning long term? It's because of the immediate needs, the basic infrastructure of Canada. So the main point here is that you can't have prosperity, right, without public infrastructure. It's an investment in the economic, social, environmental prosperity of this country. Investment enables trade. It connects workers to jobs. It allows instant communications access to education, create sanitary living, more importantly, the well-being of a community with healthcare. Infrastructure really is the backbone of our economy. National goals are actually dependent on it, whether it's clean energy, critical minerals, or public transit. And you good folks here understand that. And you have to ask yourself why our mainstream Canadians and some of the politicians have a hard time understanding that principle when it's applied to Indigenous people in Canada. Accessible, affordable housing, clean water, adequate schools, basic health care. When basic needs are met with basic infrastructure and basic services, and then you don't have to think about those things. You can start thinking about prosperity. The principles apply to Indigenous nations as well as Canadians. So, how did I get started in my career? A very wise man, Harvey Yesno, hired me because he created a job 25 years ago called the Partnership Development Advisor. He saw a need for free professional advisory services to help structure the partnership and the projects, which is really about structuring the financing. And I saw the evolution of equity participation. You know, it started probably with ABC Canada, Aboriginal Business Canada, through Industry Canada, where they offered, matching equity. So it'd be smaller deals, 50,000. They may be 30% debt, 20% equity. The interest proponent only had 10,000, and ABC would match 10,000 to allow that deal to close. The sector I saw that in would be like the forestry sector. The full of bunchers, the skidders, the timber trucks feeding the mills and the pulp and paper mills. And in that, they didn't control the forest back then, 25 years ago. The way you control the forest is through sustainable forestry license. And normally it's the mill that has that. Today, in the forestry industry, you have First Nations now that have sustainable forestry license. Controlling, their environment around that. The next thing I saw was in the mineral sector. The junior exploration companies, and if you go to Natural Resources Canada, they have an interactive map called Mineral and Mining Agreements with Indigenous Communities. There are hundreds of agreements in the exploration and mining across Canada. It's a wonderful map. And they tell you whether, if it's a light agreement or more advanced agreement, permanent agreement, from MOUs to partnership agreements to impact and benefits agreements. Whatever the case, it's a lot of intel in there. And it shows you the road to success across Canada in the mineral industry. And the mineral industry actually allowed the first equity deals in there. Because I remember this very, very distinctly. When the discovery of the Ring of Fire, when they were issuing shares, block of shares to the communities. And they actually had to go to the Ontario Security Exchange to see what the consideration was if you're issuing shares, because you can't just issue shares to anybody. There has to be some consideration. And they actually had to go to the securities lawyers to find that out. And I saw equity participation 18 years ago, or 15 years ago. And that was the first case of equity participation. In Ontario, where I saw real deal flows happening was actually hydro projects. The enabling environment there was public policy. So you had the Green Energy Act. You had the Ontario Power Authority doing planning, enabling. So three things that enabled Indigenous communities to get involved in hydro project in Ontario. One was the study money. We all know that the front end, high risk capital, and generating information, gives data, all the values in the data in the front end of any development projects, right? So they allowed study money for Indigenous communities to get involved in the front end, site investigations, or the wind regime, whatever, to get more leverage in finding partners later. The other public policy that they put in place was actually M&R. So when they deregulate or demonopolize Ontario energy sector, you had rivers that are available for development. So who gets it? It became a public policy issue for Ministry of Natural Resources to come up with what they call a Crown disposition policy. Who gets it? So they did a 100-point scale. I was part of the working group, and they did a 100-point scale. 25% management capacity, technical capacity, and 20 financial capacity, and the 25%. 25 points was actually Aboriginal participation. So people that just came in with a sort of a light agreement with communities got lower scores than those that came in that said, we're going to offer you equity. And so you saw the equity deals that are happening in the hydro sector, 18, 20 years ago, actually earlier than that, that allowed the renewable energy equity participation, for Indigenous nations in Ontario. I'm just thinking of all the sectors. I would say even I was part of Energy's Trans Canada's Energy East project, and so I had 47 Indigenous communities from the Manitoba border into Quebec, and was dealing with them on capacity agreements, IK, business readiness, business assessment, et cetera, et cetera. And TransCanada then thought about equity. They were modeling things out internally, and the challenge for them was okay, if we build this out, it was 100 plus communities from Calgary all the way to Brunswick. Like, does this model, actually apply to the other projects that we're considering, or would it kill it? And so they kind of put that aside and say, we'll offer equity-like benefits. Equity-like benefits without the risk, without the rewards or liabilities, around mostly tolls, X amount, volume going through the pipes. But today, you see the Enbridge deal, and they're offering straight up equity. Like straight up equity right into the existing assets. And then 7 or 8 weeks later, TransCanada is now, the $5 billion worth of asset sale that they're doing. And now the Indigenous communities, if you saw the Toronto Star, they're saying that now Indigenous participation possibilities with that transaction. Transmission. It sounds like a new story, but it isn't. The Five Nations Energy project, and I see Valerie here. I just saw her. 25 years ago, they designed, developed, and now operate and maintain their transmission and distribution asset. They celebrated 25 years this year. And the story around the East-West tie, a very successful story. My colleagues were part of that, and now Wate Power, who we were talking to the CEO a few weeks ago, jumping on charters going north. Another successful story, and then the recent story of Hydro One. Total transformation. The fact that they're going to offer 50%. Of major project investments to Indigenous communities. Actually, they're going to help finance it. That's how much advanced thinking they're doing to get Indigenous communities in Ontario involved in infrastructure. Remarkable, totally remarkable, from even 25 years ago. And that's when I started, was 25 years ago. And so I see the evolution, I guess you can say, of infrastructure. I'm going to touch upon this. I'm project managing the environmental impact assessment on behalf of 2 communities. Literally project managing. Tens of millions of dollars, anybody that do environmental impact, with signing authority. I didn't see that 25 years ago. Literally, we were asked to participate in environmental assessments, the ones that wanted us to be part of that. But the Ring of Fire, the communities tried to deal with the companies at the time, 15 years ago, 12 years ago, and they decided over time, let's through bilateral arrangements with Ontario, we want to be proponents. These same 2 communities protested the Ring of Fire, probably 12 years ago. We have that all documented. They Media, Tony's here, he was there. 35 below weather, going out there recording that. You think about that journey from protest to becoming the proponent over that, 12, 15-year journey. That's remarkable. And so they decided, we're going to lead this. And it became the first project under the Impact Assessment Act of Canada. And basically, cutting the regulations with them along the way. For them, they're doing this because they want to generate the information so they can make an informed decision. And it kind of goes back to UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. A lot of people focus on FPIC, free, prior, informed consent. They understand that. They're Indigenous. But they're more about self-determination. Their right to determine their own development path. FPIC is just one out of 46 clauses under that document. When you read that document, it's everything. And so they're invoking, UNDRIP and their right to self-determination. And when you think of the self-determination, you're talking about Indigenous aspirations. And you got to think about Indigenous aspirations, has you got presupposition of Indigenous autonomy. They're exercising their autonomy. It's Indigenous agency. They're going to exercise their agency. They're not going to be victims of development. They're going to become agents of development. And that's what's happening today. And that's what they understand that. So they're kind of reimagining, their lives, reimagining their lands, reimagining their livelihood. So they know it's not that simplistic. It used to be, if we get involved in mainstream, somehow, if you get involved in a deal flow, it's almost a negative correlation, that it's, a commercial positive will be a cultural negative. And they understand that's not true. And they're kind of moving forward on their development path. So this project, they have Indigenous principles integrated with the provincial principles and the federal principles in the environmental assessment. They actually designed and routed these projects based on their Indigenous knowledge. You know how projects come in and then they, the proponents ask, okay, can you give us your Indigenous knowledge so we can tweak our project design? They actually create the project design based on their Indigenous knowledge, which is the best way, right? So you don't have to modify your project design that well. They also understand that you can't have first world government, with a third world economy. I'll let that sink in. So they know that the deposits in the Ring of Fire, it's a stranded opportunity. Right? They need major infrastructure, to feed the world critical minerals, to move to a greener economy, to realize economic reconciliation. The Indigenous ecosystem is changing in Canada. It's no longer one of total forced dependency, or economic exclusion. No, we're now seeing Indigenous environmental assessments, Indigenous-led projects, Indigenous-led economies. There's a fierce sense of urgency, by our Indigenous leaders to overcome, the micro challenges, the micro complexities of dealing with their socioeconomic conditions, because they don't want that life caused by public policy, creating broken homes and broken dreams and broken hearts. They don't want that. We know, they know the history that progress has been uneven. Development has been one-sided. Benefits has been, unbalanced. Indigenous nations now are on a collective path. It's very, I'm a spiritual guy. That's what guides me, my spirit. And I hope my ego doesn't drive me, but my spirit. So it's like, when one finds the light, one follows the light, one becomes the light. So Indigenous journey is the same thing. The Indigenous nations are the Indigenous participation, the Indigenous partnership, the Indigenous proponency. They are the project. They're leading it. To be successful, that takes capacity. Like this room, right? A lot of high finance, a lot of high science, a lot of high performers. And we're trying to build that same capacity, in the Indigenous nations here in Canada, with organizations like First Nations Major Project Coalition. Total kudos to them. We're supporting each other, learning from each other. We're also bringing the future into the conversation. That's the youth. I sponsor youth to come to the conference. This is an expensive one, by the way. But Cree Angela, stand up, please. Cree Angela came all the way from Winnipeg. Welcome her. I want the Indigenous youth to feel comfortable in these rooms, not be intimidated. I was her one day, coming in here, wasn't sure, like, oh man, everybody's macked out, man. Like, with my suit from Salvation Army or whatever I got it from, it's intimidating. But I want them to feel welcome, kind of thing. That's how we did it. The partnerships like SNC's Indigenous Suite that's going to harness Indigenous talent, to become part of major undertakings is the leadership needed for economic reconciliation. So I tip my hat to them and to Derek Chum. Derek Chum, please stand up. This guy was the VP of Indigenous Relations at Hydro One, now the VP of Indigenous E3. Former corporate commercial lawyer. It's guys like him. It's women like Cree. That we got to bring more. The conversation has to be here. From a change management perspective, it's a when you think about that concept, this thing is a massive change management planning exercise, economic reconciliation. Think about that. It's almost as equal to, in my opinion, the advent of internet. The change management from the federal government, the change management provincial, the municipal, the organizational, the institutional, the corporate. Think about that change management effort. It's deep. To undo the last 150 plus years of economic exclusion. That's what I get excited about. When I see that all across the country, and that's what I see, sort of a time in a not too distant future where I'm not talking about intergenerational wounds. I'm talking about intergenerational wealth. That's what I see. And that's the journey we're on today. So thank you. Miigwech.